Today I wanted to discuss how Ben Tennyson could easily slot into the DCU. After a recent appearance on Dan Boy Wonder's channel discussing this very topic, I thought I'd expand on my thoughts on how Ben 10 could nicely slot into the DC universe, in particular how a story involving the Justice League coming in contact with Ben Tennyson would go. Ben 10 interacting with the DC universe is something we've always had teased to us with Ben vs Beast Boy in the Cartoon Network image spot, along with the time Ben met the Justice League. Both fun snippets that didn't take themselves too seriously. Now let's get into what I think adding Ben 10 to the DC universe could add to an already amazingly well-established universe with a rich history. Right off the bat, I've got a few notes and a few bits and pieces that came to me about how Ben could interact with pre-existing storylines. The first thing of note would be with the death of Superman's storyline and the introduction of the villain Doomsday. I can see Ben pretty clearly assessing Doomsday and either mistaking him for an ultimate Kryptonian or, more likely, have him work out that Doomsday went through a similar process as the Ultimates to become how he is. I don't know how Ben or the Justice League could use that to their advantage, but having more intel on what at this stage was one of the biggest bads in comic books would be useful. If you weren't already aware of Doomsday's origins, he's an ancient version of a Kryptonian, a bit like Superman, but as a baby he was repeatedly sent to a harsh environment, inevitably getting killed and having his surviving DNA recovered and used to create a more resilient version of himself over and over again, accelerating his evolution until we get the somewhat final version we see now. Though that version can now bring himself back to life, immune to the way he was defeated previously. My point being that the scientist who created Doomsday had a very similar idea of forced evolution as Albedo. Other than that, I can see Ben being an asset to the Justice League for his knowledge of aliens and all sorts. I'm certain he'd have a really fun dynamic with other superheroes, particularly ones that can transform like characters like Beast Boy, Martian Manhunter and Offspring. I can see Ben absolutely thriving in a world where superheroes are running rampant. Not only that, but I can see Kevin getting along with Metamorpho or the Metal Man. Just feels like a really nice fit for him. For those of you unfamiliar, I believe Metamorpho was likely one of the biggest design inspirations for Kevin's elemental amalgam form we see in Alien Force. And the Metal Men are pretty self-explanatory why Kevin might get along with them. Not only that, but imagine what Gwen could learn from characters like Dr. Fate, Zatanna, or John Constantine. There's also the topic of how many new transformations Ben could have access to in the DC universe. Off the top of my head, you have Kryptonians as a great start. Martians would be fantastic. Whatever Lobo is would be a really interesting transformation for Ben. I'd imagine that it would affect his personality in a similar way to Wrath. I know his entire species isn't like that, but it'd certainly be a fun idea. Before I get into my rough outline for a story, I've come up with a few more ideas that could be fun. There's certainly a lot of characters in the DC universe who have altered DNA or mutations. With the Omnitrix's ability to repair damaged DNA, imagine Ben helping villains like Killer Croc or Clayface, or really most of Batman's tragic disfigured villains. I can also see Ben having troubles adapting to the harshness of the DC universe. I know Ben dips his toes into some darker, more adult themes at times, particularly during the Alien Force era, but there's a real darkness in DC that Ben doesn't have to deal with all that often. Now getting into my idea for where I take the story. In whatever way you'd like, Ben along with Kevin and Gwen make their way to the DCU, whether that be magic, a portal, or whatever rationale you'd like. Now that they're here, they lay low for a while and they get a feel for the world. Let's say they lay low for a few months. Kevin and Gwen really wanting to lay low before Ben waltzes right up to the Hall of Justice, or perhaps a Justice League member themselves, after a big fight's taken place, it's being filmed, and says to the world that he's Ben Tennyson, a hero from another dimension, and he wants to join the Justice League. I imagine the three of them would work out who the Justice League were quite quickly over the passing few months. The whole time Ben just itching to join them, or at least meet them. Seeing them as a template for the kind of hero he wants to be, and just imagine fangirling over them. You cut to the Hall of Justice or the Watchtower where there's a debate on Ben joining. You'd have characters like Superman and Captain Marvel being pretty welcoming, Captain Marvel especially keen to have another younger member on the team, Superman being welcoming but a little bit cautious, and Batman entirely not entertaining the idea. You'd have it that Batman has somehow been monitoring Ben, Kevin and Gwen since the day they arrived. Let's say the Omnitrix appearing on Earth came up on his radar, or even Gwen's manor. Maybe Batman alongside John Constantine and Mr. Terrific were monitoring the trio in case they were a threat in any way. Not sure exactly what the device does. I'd say a Justice League member, let's say it's Superman, poses the question to Ben, what can he do? And we get our first transformation sequence with one of the more iconic aliens like Forearms or one of the aliens of that nature, maybe Humongousaur. If you think it should be a different alien, let me know. If you wanted to go for a silly moment here, you could have Grey Matter or The Worst or something with less visual impact. If you were to lean into that sort of silly idea, I can imagine Ben as Grey Matter making an interesting comment on how the Watchtower functions. And you could have Batman, Mr. Terrific, or any of the more intelligent League members ask how he knew that. And we as an audience would know it was something he just sort of worked out in the moments after he transformed. Now to the actual antagonist of the crossover special, or whatever you want to call it. Let's say Batman wasn't the only one who noticed the Omnitrix crossing over onto their Earth. In my sort of what-if situation here, Professor Ivo has been toiling away inventing. For those of you who are not familiar with Professor Ivo, he's an evil scientist who creates androids in DC. One android in particular, but we'll touch on that later. Let's say prior to the Omnitrix appearing in this dimension, Ivo's faced defeat after defeat against the hands of the Justice League. Running out of motivation, he can't find a reason to continue his work. It'd only be a failure another time. This is until the energy signature of the Omnitrix appears, and with that Ivor gets working his newest invention, Amazo. For those of you unfamiliar with Amazo, he's an android created by Professor Ivor, and my personal favourite villain in DC Comics. His major ability being power duplication, and the ability that lends itself to the story even more than that, weapon mimicry. I know the Omnitrix isn't strictly a weapon, but neither is the Green Lantern ring, and Amazo has been known to copy that. And at this point in the story, you'd have the reveal that the android is nearly complete. We'd see Ben take on some iconic villains. Let's say Ben uses Ghost Freak against Joker as a little nod to his fight against Bozo, maybe using Upgrade to defeat Lex Luthor in his mech suit. You could have Spider Monkey against Gorilla Grodd maybe, though Brainstorm or Grey Matter would probably be a more appropriate but a less visually leaked transformation. All going relatively smoothly until Amazo appears in the city. The Justice League engage him one at a time, at first mimicking Wonder Woman's powers, then the Flash's, until finally Superman steps in. Now with all their abilities at once, they're unable to take him down. And here's where you sort of think to yourself, what could Ben throw at this guy that Superman couldn't? And here is where you may have thought, and Ben thinks for a fraction of a second, Alien X. Before a Justice League member, let's say it was Superman, says, wait, whatever you're about to transform into, just know he can do whatever it can right back. Limiting Ben's options here a bit, you definitely wouldn't want to go Alien X or Clockwork, for example. Let's say that Ben selects just the right alien here, one who doesn't give Amazo that much more abilities, but an alien that's sort of helpful enough to tip the scales in their favour. Amazo starts to slow down a bit here. The Justice League are just starting to get a few more hits in when Amazo locks in on Ben, and you see the completed Omnitrix start to form on his wrist with a flash of green light. Now very seriously, I don't know where I'd go from here. Amazo's an android, so the easy answer is someone like Upgrade or Nanomech. There's also the option of Ben using Superman as the DNA sample for a Kryptonian, overpowering Amazo with 2 Kryptonians. You could even throw an Amalgam Kevin in here, defeating him in a similar way to how they did with Angregor, creating a new DCU Amalgam Kevin form, which could be pretty cool. I'd probably go with an alien like Feedback. He'd probably be the most interesting way of finishing off Amazo. I can also see a version of Amazo here turning into Alien X and just being at a forever standstill with the 2 personalities. I'm sure there's endless possibilities of what you could do with this story, or really any story where Ben goes over to the DCU. I think if anything, Ben would make a really great member of the Teen Titans. He's used to working in a team, just not quite in that capacity, could lead to some interesting conflicts and stories. I'd absolutely love to know what you'd do with Ben in the DCU, and where the story could have gone from there. Thanks for watching.